Hello, everyone. Welcome. Greetings from Georgetown University, Qatar. I'm Firat, Oruc, and it is really a great pleasure to serve as moderator for tonight's faculty's seminar talk by Professor Ian Almond on Armenians in modern Turkish literature, the case of Ahmet Hamdi Tanpinar. And I am quite honored to have also as respondent one of my colleagues and dear friend Mehmet Fatih Uslu joining us from Istanbul. It is really, that's one of the great conveniences of webinars, to be able to bring in scholars in sync from different locations. So I'm really excited that that is taking place. In terms of our format, Professor Ian Almond, after my introduction, will give his talk, which is going to be about 40 minutes. This will be followed by a commentary on the talk by Professor Mehmet Fatih Uslu. And then we will open it for a Q&A session. Hopefully it will take place in the last 25 minutes or so of our webinar. Professor Ian Almond is a dear colleague here at Georgetown University. He is the author of 6 books, most recently 2 Fates, 1 Banner from Harvard University Press 2009, and The Thought of Nirad Chaudhry from Cambridge University Press 2015, and over 50 articles in a variety of journals. He specializes in comparative world literature with a tricontinental emphasis on Mexico, Bengal, and Turkey. His work has been translated into 15 languages. The Arabic translation of his book, Sufism and Deconstruction, was shortlisted, one of 7, for the largest literary prize in existence, the Sheikh Zayed Book Prize. And his 6th book, which is forthcoming, World Literature Decentered, Beyond the West Through Turkey, Mexico, and Bengal, will be out next year. Professor Mehmet Fatih Uslu, whom I consider one of the pioneering and most impressive scholars of critical Ottoman and Turkish literary studies, is Associate Professor of Turkish Language and Literature at Istanbul Şehir University. He is the author of Conflict and Negotiation, Armenian and Turkish Dramatic Literature in the Ottoman Empire, published in 2014 in Turkish. He is also the co-editor of the volume Tanzimat and Literature, Modern Literary Culture in the Ottoman Istanbul, which is a really groundbreaking volume that he co-edited with another dear friend, Fatih Altu, in 2014. He has translated numerous works of literature and humanities from English, Italian, and Armenian into Turkish. He continues to translate from Armenian with a special focus on the works of Ottoman Armenian writer Zabel Yeseyan. His ongoing research projects include a monograph on the fictional work of Zabel Yeseyan and a volume on the comparative analysis of Armenian and Turkish literatures between 1908 and 1914. Tonight, Professor Almond's talk promises to be an impressive exercise in the political unconscious of arguably the most important novelist of the Turkish literary canon, Ahmet Hamdi Tanpinar. I borrowed the term the political unconscious from America's foremost Marxist critic, Frederick Jameson, a term that indicates the implicit, latent, repressed political dimensions of creative works. In this book, Jameson posits the following remarkable statement, and I quote, "History is what hurts. It is what refuses desire and sets inexorable limits to individual as well as collective praxis," end of quote. Those of us who know Professor Almond's work will agree that one of the distinguishing characteristics of his scholarship has been its keen determination to unearth what lies beneath literary and aesthetic bandages. Professor Almond, I now hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I want to thank both Dr. Oruc and Dr. Uslu for their time today. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank the participants, the people who are tuning in. Thank you for giving us your attention today. I'm just going to talk very generally about Armenians in Tanpinar. I just want to start out by saying that I've spent a lot of academic energy over the years trying to unearth various Western amnesias about non-Western or non-Christian minorities. And there is a spirit of trying to sort of draw attention to the various violences which the West has inflicted upon the non-West in my work. So today, I'm sort of moving a little bit in the opposite direction by looking at a series of ethnic massacres, quite possibly some people will call it a genocide, which was inflicted upon the Christian minorities of Ottoman Turkey in the years 1893 to 94, and then most importantly in 1915. First of all, I just want to talk a little bit about Tanpinar himself, because one of the things which is guiding this is trying to understand how writers deal with incongruous elements in their work, how they deal with unpalatable histories. And this is, be they Turkish writers, be they Belgian writers, be they German, Austrian, British, exactly how these sort of incongruous elements abide and somehow sometimes manifest themselves in work. Why Tanpinar? Well, as Dr. Oruc just said at the beginning, Tanpinar is perhaps the greatest writer of the Turkish 20th century. He occupies the kind of pivotal figure, I think, in 20th century Turkish letters that, T.S. Eliot or Tagore or Paz occupies in their various national literatures. His range goes from novels across short stories, across brilliant collections of essays like Five Cities, and even perhaps one of the most respected works of literary criticism on the Turkish 19th century literature, his book, 19th Century Turkish Literary History. Tanpinar really sort of established himself as a major figure in his field. And I think I'll just briefly talk a little bit about the shift in critical reception. So despite the weight of Tanpinar's literary stature, and of course, Turkish colleagues here are intimately familiar with this, but I'm saying this for people who perhaps are not familiar with this scenario. it's interesting to sort of see the way in which this shifted. So primarily because of Tanpinar's own religious conservative reservations towards Kemalist modernity, perhaps we might say. He was pretty much on the outside of the mainstream literary canon for many years, certainly in the Republican period. And it was really, I think Jale Parler is the first to sort of say that it's Bernard Moran who credits Tanpinar with a kind of literary status regardless of whatever your political affiliation is. And I think sort of from the 80s onwards, Tanpinar begins to grow in stature and begins sort of acquire not just Muslim conservative readerships who were always reading Tanpinar, but also across a variety of different demographics within Turkey. Even though it should be said that in terms of his international status, it has been someone, and I think it does remain still somewhat belated, although I would say over the past 5 years, there's been a tremendous explosion of translations in a dozen languages of his work. This shift sort of, in many ways, what emerged is that Tanpinar became seen almost as a minority figure, as someone who, as a professor of Ottoman lyric poetry, was somehow on the margins of his own literary milieu. He dies in 1962, and there has been sort of a way, various ways in which Tanpinar emerged as a marginal writer. When I say marginal, I don't mean marginal in terms of his ethnicity or of his gender, but rather because he had, one of the themes in his work was this abiding interest in the demise and the melancholy aftermath of the demise of the Ottoman Empire and what that meant mnemonically in a period of marching modernity. So we get really sort of a number of ways in which Tanpinar emerges not just as a marginalized figure, but in almost a subversive figure. Comparisons with Benjamin abound, and people see Tanpinar as someone who interrogates modernity, interrogates sort of rigid ideological structures, and really, I would say in many ways, and I'm more than happy to be corrected on this, but in many ways, acquiring almost a faintly progressive veneer through this position of being marginalized. And I would say into the sort of 2000, until about sort of 10 years ago, this was the case. But then a shift started to take place, or at least started. Certainly, the most recent voices emerged, probably Orhan Okay's biography of 2010, which in many ways raised some concerns about Tanpinar's own religious and nationalist views. And this, of course, to be sort of explicitly political here, this, of course, chimes in with the zeitgeist of the moment. The fact that the secular elites who, in Tanpinar's lifetime, marginalized Tanpinar, it can be said, are very much now themselves in the margins of society. And to some extent, this fate of critical fortune for Tanpinar is reflected in this. But we're seeing a number of figures. So Orhan Okay points out that in Tanpinar's last year at Darul Fanoon, the university which would later become Istanbul University, a number of professors from minorities were expelled, and there were agitations by nationalist students to expel a number of professors, including one Armenian professor of literature, Basamin Effendi. And the 5 students who agitated for this were very close friends of Tanpinar at the time. And Okay quite clearly writes, what did Tanpinar think of this? We have no idea, but we need some sort of questions. We need some sort of answers. And Okay's voice is perhaps the first of the most recent voices, but there have been others. So both Vivet Kenetti has drawn attention to the way some of the promiscuous non-Muslim female characters in Tanpinar's work sort of embody Turkish fantasies of what Christian females are. And I think also Gözde Yilmaz in general has sort of commented on the very sunny Turkishness of the general landscape and indeed the mindscape of Tanpinar's work. And that's really sort of has culminated in figures like Orhan Koçak, I think, who has been most pressing in pointing out some of the real problematic aspects of the ways in which Tanpinar speaks and, perhaps even more importantly, doesn't speak about Armenians in his work. There's only really, and I'll get onto this in a moment. I think the second reason why I'm choosing Tanpinar, apart from his obvious stature, is that Tanpinar himself had a number of Armenian connections. So over the past 15, 20 years, it's gradually come to light that Tanpinar taught in a number of Armenian schools, two in particular, the Esiyer Ortaokul, an Armenian school, I think in Shishli or maybe in Beyoğlu, and also the Pangalta Mehitarian Lisesi. He taught there between 1933 to 37. He had Armenian friends, perhaps most notably Mari Gerek Mezian, in Turkey, a famous figure, the lover of Bedri Rahmi Eyüboğlu, the famous sculptor. And I think in other ways as well, when you look at Tanpinar's biography, it's interesting. Tanpinar at the age of 14, in the crucial year of 1915, his father was a Qadi, an Ottoman judge. And in those crucial months of 1915, they were actually in the town of Kirkuk, which is today in present-day Iraq. And, Tanpinar writes about this many years later in an essay about that particular slice of his childhood, and sort of comments on, amongst other things, he sort of talks about what the town was like, doesn't mention anything to do with the Armenian atrocities that took place, even though Kirkuk was a final ground which would, a kind of last station, which would gather up some of the deportations that were overflowing from the already saturated camps of Deir al-Zor. And although it's not really clear, it's not likely that Tanpinar's father was involved in this. He was involved in sort of general preparations and mobilizations for the war effort. And the fact that it was such a crucial point does suggest that does give an idea of how close the events of 1915 do impinge biographically on Tanpinar's own life himself. And then I suppose finally, the final reason why we gravitate towards Tanpinar in this is that Tanpinar's central themes in itself, you could argue, are those of memory and oblivion. Tanpinar is fascinated in the way the memory of the Ottoman Empire, of the defunct Ottoman Empire, lingers on almost spectrally in the modern period. And in doing so, in narrating, if you like, this memory of lost worlds or annihilated worlds, there is a kind of irony. It's almost, one might almost say, there's a case of one case of amnesia trying to analyze another. There is a kind of irony in that a writer so centrally concerned with forgetfulness and oblivion, actually has a blind spot themselves at the heart of this. There's only two Armenian characters in Tanpinar's work. The first one is Madame Alekchian in the 1950 novel of Tanpinar's, Those Outside the Scene, a very minor character. And then the second character is really a three-page cameo, a three-page representation in the middle of the Time Regulation Institute, where we meet an Armenian watchmaker briefly called Agop Horologian, who's really sort of in many ways he's the embodiment of all the stereotypes that people like Murat Belge have already pointed out about Turkish representations of Armenian. You know, he's foreign looking, he's a bit greedy, and sort of shifty and false. You know, he's sort of slightly, there's an air of mendacity about him. So I suppose it's already sort of slightly disappointing that the only other Armenian character in that novel is a dancing girl. So there's a kind of disappointingly monodimensional feel to Tanpinar's Armenian characters. I mean, to be fair, Tanpinar did not provide vicious or nasty images necessarily of Armenians, unlike very gifted writers such as Halide Edep and Ömer Seyfettin, who could, you know, who produced some very negative images of Armenians in their work, but also he didn't produce any thoughtful or positive images of Armenians like writers such as Kemal Tahir were capable of doing. In talking about, to Tanpinar's credit, and I'm really sort of trying to keep this fair, he does mention Armenians both in Five Cities and in his literary criticism in the middle of his work on 19th century Turkish literary history. He's got a small section in the middle where he doesn't hide at all the Turkish Armenian origins of Turkish drama. He's actually quite explicit about it, and points out that the first Turkish dramas really sort of drew on Armenian origins, and even sort of has a section devoted to Agop Gulu, one of the Armenian organizers or producers of one of the first companies in Istanbul. And even though, although every time he mentions the word Armenian, there's a constant use of the word foreign or ejnebi with that. Nevertheless, there is sort of very candid, detailed section on that in his work. When we get to Five Cities, I think it's somewhat more broader and somewhat more fascinating, because Five Cities in itself is a collection of essays on Bursa, Erzurum, Konya, Istanbul. It's an exquisitely written collection of essays. Within about 100 pages, Tanpinar supplies a very eloquent and lyrical sequence of reflections on architecture, on time, on history, and there's something quite powerful and quite winning in many ways about the way he blends this invocation of Turkish history together to produce a very sublime piece of writing. However, and I'm going to be saying this again and again, when you read the book with Armenians in mind, his text acquires a number of ironies. I guess the first one is that he deifies Çelebi. He absolutely loves Evliya Çelebi, the famous 16th century Ottoman traveler, quotes Çelebi repeatedly, says they should have named a gate after him in Erzurum and so on. Like, you really get this sense that Çelebi is someone that Tanpinar is very influenced by. But when you actually go to Çelebi's Seyahatname, when you look, Çelebi, unlike Tanpinar, talks constantly about Armenians. You know, in his travels through Anatolia, he's constantly mentioning not just Armenians, but he's even mentioning how in some towns in Anatolia, Armenians constitute the majority. He even has a handy 2 pages of phrases in Armenian for any travelers who find themselves wandering through there. He says you can't sort of get by without it, including some obscene phrases, which I won't repeat. But again, that's not necessarily a major thing. Tanpinar, to his credit, does mention a couple of times Armenians in Five Cities, but it does give a sense already of a kind of filtering process at work in Tanpinar as he takes his sources, and when we look at this disparity between the sources he's influenced by and the text he produces. I think probably a second irony is the figure of Mimar Sinan. So Mimar Sinan really sort of occupies a key position in Tanpinar's text. Really sort of, it's almost like a pivotal Turkish character. And as a number of our viewers will know, it's not an absolute fact, but it's widely felt that Mimar Sinan was not simply of Christian origin, but non-Muslim origin, but it's very possible that he was Armenian from a town outside Kayseri. And there is a kind of irony in the way Mimar Sinan, and Mimar Sinan for our non-Turkish audience is almost like the Ottoman Christopher Wren or the Ottoman Michelangelo. He's really sort of the key architect of the Ottoman Empire. And I'll even I'll show briefly a passage here. Where we read, this is in the middle of Beş-Şehir, of 5 cities. One of destiny's strangest aspects is that we do not know where today's decision may lead us. The young warriors fighting on the plains of Manzikert certainly never dreamt that the curves of their swords in the air and the horizon that resounded with their horses' hoofbeats all bore within them the seeds of Sinan, Hayreddin, Itri, and Dede. Destiny had sent them to this plain to perfect a side of the human spirit, to realize one of creation's dreams, yaratılışın büyük rüyalarından biri gerçekleşsin diye. They were under orders from the creative soul, they obeyed her. And this passage, which almost seems to be taken out of Maurice Barrès, this sort of moment of nationalist sublimity. It's fascinating to see the way Mimar Sinan, this Armenian architect, is incorporated alongside an Ottoman admiral, a Turkish general, a Sufi poet, into this sort of vision, sublime vision of a nationalist project, even retrospectively. And again, the most we're talking about here is ironies, but already, I think what we see here is an aesthetic commitment to a certain kind of topography, a certain kind of semantic mirage. And you almost get the feeling that it's not just that Tanpinar deleted the Armenianness, because deleting the Armenianness of Sinan, to be fair, is within an Ottoman period, the ethnicity of a figure like Sinan wouldn't have been of paramount importance in the first place. Ethnicity would have been of a secondary consideration anyway. But there is almost this sense in which Tanpinar had no choice but to delete it, that there was something about the compelling comprehensiveness of this vision that simply wouldn't be able to accommodate something as incongruous as a Christian and certainly as an Armenian architect at the heart of it. And we're going to get back to this idea again and again. And I really want to try and go through this as quickly as possible. One of the most interesting silences, I think, in 5 cities, because in Tanpinar, what we really are talking about here is sins more or less of omission. You know, we're not really talking about, as I've said, vicious stereotypes, or there aren't really any in Tanpinar. But what we're talking about here is a certain kind of void, a certain kind of lacunae that takes place. And I think one of the most interesting silences comes again in 5 cities, where walking along, he hears a song. And again, I'll just share the screen. And this was in Konya, and this is when, in the immediate aftermath of 1915, 1916, a 15-year-old Tanpinar, as a young boy still, is walking through Konya, and he says, among the women of the Konya prison, there was one whose face I'd never seen, but whose voice I recognized. I used to wait for her voice in the evening hours, and I particularly longed for her song, my armful of roses in the vineyards of Gesi. To hear this strange melody, Acayip Türkü, is like swallowing a handful of poison, zehire, unaware. The first thing to say is that obviously Gesi here was an Armenian majority town in the province of Kayseri. And the song actually is a very famous song. Even today in Turkey, it's a very popular song. There is a feeling that this song was often sung amongst Armenians. It's a lament. It's got a plaintive tone to it, and even though it's a romantic song, there is at least some Armenian commentators have said that it was a song which was sung in the aftermath of the felaket, if you like, of the catastrophe. But it is interesting that this comes in the middle, and in such a strange way, it comes sort of randomly into the text. And Tanpinar doesn't say it's an Armenian song and doesn't say that the woman's Armenian. But we almost get the sense that, because there's a kind of, you get a sense of the violence which is almost mentioned, like Tanpinar almost goes on to talk about it, but he breaks himself at the moment and immediately switches, incidentally, again to a quote by Maurice Barrès. And I'm going to talk about Barrès in a moment. This is the French fascist intellectual and poet. But when we consider in particular the idea that this is poison, that, obviously in one sense, he's talking about the kind of the effect that this dramatic rush of melancholy would have on the listener to hear this. But there is also a sense, I think, in Tanpinar that this poison is closer to what Cathy Carruth would call the truth of the incomprehensibility of the event. And this is one of the things I am going to argue, that in very, very subtle ways, Tanpinar, in very unacknowledged ways, Tanpinar is going to be this is going to emerge in Tanpinar in a kind of metonomically displaced way. There's going to be moments where this repressed kind of awareness of this tremendous violence is acknowledged. Now, of course, there is an explicit acknowledgement of the violence that was committed upon Armenian minorities in 5 cities. It's probably the only expressed in his work, the only express reference, and it comes in his chapter on Erzurum. And again, I'll just share this just to. And here, Tanpinar is talking about the mayor of Erzurum at the time. He's talking about the American investigators who, in 1916, were sent out across Anatolia to sort of investigate the various sort of reports of ethnic cleansing that had been taking place. Who doesn't remember Zakir Bey, mayor at this time, and his reply to the American Commission, which had come to Erzurum after the armistice years to inquire about the Armenian affair? "Look here, sir," he said to the interpreter. "These gentlemen have a lot to say. Let me tell the general in a very few words who were the majority in Erzurum." And he took the member of the commission to the window of the house where they were living and said, "See, the bigger section is the Muslim cemetery. The smaller one is the Armenian cemetery. For sure, they haven't devoured their own dead." So this isn't a passage where, for about 10 pages earlier on, Tanpinar had already couched Erzurum in a very sort of almost oriental way. He'd stressed, even though Erzurum in 1914 had about 20% of its population was Armenian, and there was an estimated 500 churches in the province of Erzurum. We get in 5 cities, Tanpinar sort of stresses the essentially Turkish feel of Erzurum, almost as a touchstone of Turkishness. You know, he tells us that there's 54 mosques and 38 medresi there. The passage is blended in with his own grandmother's recollections of her Hajj to Mecca and Yemen. And so again, we have a situation in which a landscape is saturated with a certain, as Gözde Yilmaz puts it, a certain Sunni Turkishness, almost a kind of sublimity which can't allow for anything to disrupt it or disturb it. And it is this reluctance to have this semantic tapestry disturbed, which basically causes Tanpinar to repeat the Erzurum mayor's denial of the violence. And in many ways to repeat the deletion of Armenianness from not just Erzurum, but from the wider history of the region. And here, like, even though I've mentioned Maurice Barrès, and it is interesting to see how in looking at Tanpinar's cosmopolitanism, his interest in the writers of the Action Française, Charles Maurras in particular, and Maurice Barrès, whom Tanpinar cites repeatedly throughout his work. Although Nazim Irem and others have quite rightly pointed out sort of the very conservative atmosphere of the Derga publishing group, the writers, the Derga writers, Tanpinar probably encountered, and these were writers that were reading Barrès and citing Barrès and Maurras to one another very excitedly. And Tanpinar encountered Maurice Barrès for the first time as a student in the lectures of his mentor, Yahya Kemal. Yahya Kemal had a series of lectures, and in one of them he talks about Maurice Barrès, and about in particular, he praises what he calls the Vechdinintari, the ecstasy of history, the idea that one could almost lose oneself in the ecstasy of one's own culture, in the ecstasis, yeah, the standing outside, the annihilation of oneself in some kind of sublime object which incorporates one. And certainly this idea of the nation as a kind of organic entity, a spiritual entity, which we find in this kind of neo-fascist spirituality, this conservative French spirituality in the Action Française, has an effect on Tanpinar. And there's a whole question there whether that is the deciding factor, or whether we can really sort of even talk about, you know, some kind of Sufi mystical vocabulary is also facilitating this kind of dissolution into a kind of oneness. But having said that, because I guess like what I'm interested in here is that there's a vein of humanism in Tanpinar. And there's a vein, this sounds very conventional, I would even argue there's a vein of human decency in Tanpinar. And at what point in Tanpinar did this commitment to a nationalist sublime, with all of its powerful, ecstatic demands, trump this sense of humanity, you know? Because this deletion of the Armenian, not just semantically, but also physically, because Tanpinar knew enough to know what had happened. And even though Tanpinar definitely addresses the violence that took place, but in the moments that he does, it generally speaks about it somewhat euphemistically as a kind of conflict. He doesn't really ever, he never calls it ethnic cleansing. he gives a sense of the general chaos of war, but is reluctant to sort of see it as any kind of integral project of a larger nationalist project here. So, I mean, I'm going to try and do this as quickly as possible. The last 5 minutes or so, I'm just going to try and give an exclusively Armenian reading of Tanpinar's masterpiece, his novel Huzur, translated into English by Guknar, A Mind at Peace. And again, what I'm going to be asking is, what happens when we read Huzur, when we read this novel exclusively with Armenians and with Talat Pasha and with the Committee of Union and Progress, with this in mind? Yeah. Are we skewing it? Because the possibility that we are skewing this otherwise tremendously philosophical and erudite reflection on responsibility and morality and aesthetics and decadence in a sort of sectarian direction? Or alternatively, is there, as Zizek talks about turning the subject awry and seeing it from a different angle, is there a vein of unpalatable, unarticulable truth when we look at this novel from the point of view of Armenians? Because the cliche that everybody says about Huzur, that most scholarship say begins with, is that it's a novel about huzursuzluk, so a mind at peace, but it's a novel about restlessness. But I think when you read it with this in mind, certain passages do stand out. The first one, I'll just share very briefly. Occurs more or less near the beginning of the novel. As Mumtaz looked at this shop, Malame's line came to mind. It's ended up here through some nameless catastrophe. Meçhul bir felaketten. Here in this dusty shop from whose walls hung handmade tricot stockings. Beside these books, in open hawkers' cases, were lapfuls of testimonials to our inner transformation, our desire to adapt, and our search for ourselves in new contexts and climes. Pulp novels with illustrated covers, textbooks, French yearbooks with faded green bindings, and pharmaceutical formulas. As if the detritus of the mind of mankind had been hastily exposed in this market, books mixed and intermingled, texts on reading fortunes in coffee grounds alongside classicist Mommsen's vision of Rome, remnants of Payot editions, Karakin Devejian Effendi's treatise on fish and ichthyology, as well as subjects like veterinary medicine, modern chemistry, and the techniques of geomancy. So in the middle of this, this is a moment where the protagonist, Mumtaz, is looking at this sort of alleyway filled with rubbish. But in the middle of all of this rubbish, this detritus of history, yeah, of this lost Ottoman world, all of these, in the modernizing project that is surging on in 30s Istanbul at the time, you have all of this sort of this discarded debris. We find an Armenian scholar, Karakin Devejian, a famous Armenian scholar, his book thrown in amongst all of this rubbish. And the name there, even through, it's all happened through some nameless catastrophe. Meçhul means literally unknown. But you get the sense here that this nameless catastrophe for Tanpinar is possibly also an unnameable catastrophe. There's something unspeakable about this. And I would even go so far as to say that perhaps one of the dark veins in this novel, because it famously culminates, or not quite culminates, in the suicide of one of the protagonists, Suad. When we look at it from the point of view of 1915, I don't think it's psychoanalytically outrageous to suggest that one source of this unease is the non-memory of violence in this text. And certainly the irony, I guess the most obvious thing to say here is that the annihilation of the Ottoman world, which famously Huzur deals with, the Armenian world goes hand in hand with that Ottoman world. So the lost object, which Tanpinar is always recognized as lamenting and examining and reproducing, to some extent is connected to this, not synonymous, but definitely related to the Armenian world, which also was to more or less come to an end in 1915. So this pairing of the two is interesting, I think, because it does show a tension between, on the one hand, Tanpinar's nostalgia towards this Ottoman world, this lost Ottoman object, a tension between that, but also this commitment to a nationalist aesthetic, a nationalist sublime. And then, of course, and I really sort of, I want to really sort of go through this quickly, but there are a number of other things that you know, if you want to sum up, are interesting in a novel like A Mind at Peace, like Huzur. The first thing is the presence of characters who are closely associated with the Committee for Union and Progress. The CUP, for people who don't know, was one of the central organizations which took part in the ethnic cleansing of Armenians. And both Nuran's mother and her uncle, Nazia and Tevfik, have sort of careers, know people who are directly involved in the CUP. And the committee, the organization is referenced a number of times in the text. This is interesting because, again, it's not wholly articulated why. In fact, the violence, there's no mention of Armenians. In fact, Armenians are mentioned twice in the entire 400-page novel. But it already sounds a certain gong. It already sounds a certain bell. And it's augmented, I think, by the use of the name Talat. So again, for people who are unfamiliar with this, Talat Pasha is arguably one of the architects, one of the chief architects of the ethnic cleansing, which you know, some people would refer to as genocide, but definitely of the large-scale violence that took place in 1915. I think it's Nuran's grandfather. His name is Talat. The name appears 10 times in the novel, and it's a completely fictitious character. It has no connection whatsoever to Talat Pasha. But it is, again, a loaded name. It would be the equivalent of, for example, having a German post-war novel with a protagonist called Adolf. It's a loaded name which has certain connotations, and again lends this kind of shadow to the novel if you are reading it from this angle. We also have the Christianizing of Suad's suicide. So Suad is almost a kind of like a westernized atheist Dostoevskian figure who ultimately self-implodes, if you like. He commits suicide to the sound of Beethoven, hangs himself in the last quarter of the novel. But the suicide is very interesting because Tanpinar Christianizes it. Tanpinar talks about the crucifixion. He describes it as a crucifixion. And then 3 days later, Mumtaz sees Suad's resurrected ghost, which again, it's explicitly Christ-like. You know, the ghost of Suad shows Mumtaz the stigmata of his bleeding wounds. And then almost immediately after that, we find the only Armenian character in the novel, which is Mumtaz is wandering through the streets, having just seen Suad's ghost, and he encounters, and I can even actually just briefly read it, he encounters an Armenian beggar. He entered the city through a gate in the ramparts that he didn't recognize. An Armenian woman, bir Ermeni kadın, crouching beside a small concrete police kiosk, stretched out a hand. My son helped me so that I might stand up. After gazing at her as if to say, do you really need to get up? He lent her a hand. The elderly woman stood with difficulty. There's a church nearby. It's a sacred place. It's worn down though. If you have the desire to make an offering, go ahead and do so. It'll be granted. I'm heading there myself. Why don't those advocating for society understand people? Man and life were separate entities. He'd neither be able to forego his individual contentment, nor forget about the terrible needs of the society that surrounded him, including the hapless 10-year-old girl attending to a saint's tomb and the aged Armenian woman, İhtiyar Ermeni karısını. I'm feeble, a feeble man simply created out of weakness. Which of us isn't? As he uttered this last part, he realized that he had Suad in mind. In the little coffee house that he ducked into, he removed Suad's letter from his pocket and began to read it for the umpteenth time. So again, that's just to show that this Armenian woman briefly appears almost like a ghost and then vanishes again. And there's a kind of spectrology here. Yeah, that it's almost a kind of synonym of ghost with consciousness, with conscience, I would argue here, as the ethical briefly flares up in Tanpinar, and we get this momentary apparition of the old Armenian woman. And I think the final thing I'll say about Huza, and I'll close with this, is that you have a lot of references to Hitler. Hitler sort of is seen, there's about 20, 25 references to Hitler, various ways, but traditionally, the novel ends on the eve of the Second World War. And I think conventionally, when critics have argued about this, they've said that the Second World War is Hitler symbolizes the kind of barbarism and fanaticism and savagery, which will bring an end to the European dream. And in many ways also brings an end to the dream of Nuran and Mumtaz. You know, this masal dunyasını, this magical fairy tale world is sort of dispelled at the end, because the novel dramatically ends on the speech of the annexation of Poland. And yet it's not the only time that Tanpinar linked or raised the spectre of Hitler, because in the penultimate year of his life, Tanpinar met at a party in Paris the American Armenian writer William Sarian, and when he asked Sarian where he was from, and Sarian said, I was born in Bitlis, a town in southeast Turkey. Tanpinar says, I spent my childhood near there. It's a diary entry. We don't really know much more than that. It's a very brief exchange. But the exchange, meeting Sarian, must have had some kind of effect, because 3 months later, in the pages of Cumhuriyet, Tanpinar writes the only article where he'll ever explicitly deal with the echo of the Armenian issue. Like, he has an article called, I think it's called Crime and Social Justice. İçtimai Çurum ve İnsan Adalet, I think. But in it, he sort of, amongst other things, he's basically lamenting the way a prime minister like Menderes could sort of lay waste to the country. But crucially, he couples together Abdülhamit II and Hitler. Abdülhamit II, who's the Sultan, who didn't oversee 1915, but was responsible for the Hamidiya massacres of 1893 to 94. And this linking here, I think, is interesting, because it does suggest that there's some, at the back of Tanpinar's mind, there was some kind of subtextual, unconscious connection between this architect of violence and a figure that in many other ways, Tanpinar, as a Francophile and as something of a Europhile, would have conventionally loathed. Yeah? Hitler follow. In many ways, Tanpinar, I think, imbibed a lot of the Prussophobia that he found in Maurice Barrès and Maurras. Barrès in particular saw Prussians as barbarians. So I'm gonna wind up there because I don't want to go on. I've gone on for 45 minutes actually, but I'll stop there and turn it over to my respected colleague, Fatih.
Okay. First, it's great to be here with you, with Ian and Firat. It's a great pleasure and proud for me. And thank you for having me, of course. And thank you, Ian, for this inspiring presentation and the paper. I read the paper. So you raised many significant questions, I think, which are really curious to me. And in these 10 minutes, I would like to put some basic remarks and observations, which I hope will allow us to ask more questions and think of your points in the paper. More questions, not answers, unfortunately. Yes, Ian talked about the amnesia in Tanpinar, the void, the lacuna, and this is a striking fact to any reader, I think. Let me start with some general remarks and observations to contextualize it, which is, I think, functions as the base of Ian's paper. My first remark is that one can easily say that in Turkish literature of the 20th century, in general, we do not see a pattern that shows a real interest in representing Ottoman Turkish Armenians or the Ottoman past of the empire and modern Turkey. Of course, one can show some of them here and there, bits and pieces, but those do not make up a stable and clear pattern. And among those few, there are almost nothing fully dedicated to the catastrophe Armenians were subjected to in 1950. So this void, this lacuna, is, I think, is valid for the whole modern Turkish literature. And this pattern changed in last years, especially after the assassination of Hrant Dink in 2007. The number of new volumes of novels, especially novels, dedicated to the Great Catastrophe increased dramatically. The theme became a popular one in last decades, unlike the previous century. And let me note a very interesting point, that the theme is one of the most popular themes in blooming Kurdish literature. I mean, Kurdish literature in Kurdish. So now the trend has changed dramatically. And another important remark for me is about the Ottoman Empire. Before 1950, the Ottoman Empire had a very colorful and vibrant literary scene in different languages of the empire. However, in terms of representing the other, representing the neighbor nation, the neighbor millet, there was not a real and deep interest again. I mean, in the 19th century Turkish literature, there were not many literary texts that represent Ottoman Armenians and their lives in the empire. Of course, there were exceptions like Ahmet Mithat Efendi's Müşahedat. And the reverse version of this inference is also true. Armenian fiction in the Ottoman Empire was mostly lacking representations of the Turks. This is another curious point, and I think it displays a sort of solid compartmentalization of Ottoman nations, even though a kind of modern public sphere emerged in the second half of the 19th century. And totally shocking is the fact that no literary translations were made from Armenian into Turkish, Turkish in the Arabic script, I mean, until 1910. In other words, the Turkish-speaking public was almost completely unaware of their fellow countrymen's literary output. The question here is, again, very curious for any researcher. What was the base of this blindness or negligence? Most Armenians were natives of Turkish, but Turks did not have the skills of Armenian, of course. Why did they not try to overcome this asymmetry? It's very difficult to answer. Anyway, even the translators of these early translations were all ethnic Armenians, not Turks. To sum up, I can say that Turkish intellectuals and reading public were not full of curiosity for Armenians and Armenian culture, even in the times of the Ottoman Empire. When we proceed to modern Turkey, of course, the landscape was totally changed and the country's demography was much more different than the Ottoman empires. But anyway, I think we need to include this incuriosity in Ottoman Turkish Muslim intellectuals to our analysis, and this lack of representation of Armenians in modern Turkish literature in the 20th century must have some links with the lack that emerged in the 19th century, modern Ottoman Turkish literature. In modern Turkey, of course, we all know non-Muslims gradually left the country and the country became much more homogeneous. Once the heaven of multiculturalism, now Istanbul and Anatolia became 99% Muslim, as we all say. We always say. The Turkish identity obviously was very dominant and overbearing. Under this atmosphere, Armenian parts of the country was subject to a conscious amnesia for everyone. Denial was ubiquitous and it was something foundational for the Republic, I think. As Mark Nishanyan pointed out for another context, this was a scene where any possibility of mourning was interdicted. I think not only for Armenians, but also Turks and Kurds. Because very basically, forgetfulness in the final analysis means forbidden mourning. Tanpinar, in spite of the originality of his writing, was among the early Republican elite. He himself was a typical Republican intellectual, at least in a way, which has some basic and fundamental qualities, I think. As Tuncay Birkan underlined his wonderful book, Dünya ile Devlet Arasında Türk Muharriri, The Turkish Order Between the World and the State, those were mostly engaged to the state. They felt that their destiny is somehow bound to the one of the state and the republic. So they always, at least mostly, wanted to be in the circle. Yes, as Ian showed it, people think that Tanpinar is different. He was a critic of the republic, at least in a way, again. So his corpus was mostly neglected, although he was a high-quality author. I have some slight objections to this explanation. I think Tanpinar fans a little bit exaggerate this point, but let us accept it's a true interpretation. And his way of criticism, Tanpinar's way of criticism, here mostly depends on a sort of memory politics. We all know that his obsession with memory, and one can think that the Republic is a futuristic project. The new Turkish elites chose to forget many things of the recent past intentionally. Think of alphabet reform, language reform, and other cultural reforms, which were obvious attempts to cut the links with the Ottoman past. So here, of course, memory itself can be employed as a way of this cultural politics. We know that Tanpinar was under the influence of Henri Bergson, and he has a kind of mysticism, mostly stemming from, again, Bergson, I think. And in this way, he found a way to criticize the Kemalist project. Sherif Eskin's book, Zamanın ve Hafızanın Kıyısında, On the Shores of Time and Memory, is an important contribution, especially to understand how Tanpinar internalized Bergsonian theory. Here, I mostly follow up his arguments. And Bergson believes that oblivion is impossible. Nothing can be completely forgotten. Tanpinar totally agrees with Bergson, and he even thinks that this is valid even for societies and nations. In his Woman on the Moon, his protagonist asks, quoting, "When a man is not happy with his past, he almost denies his past. Isn't it the same with societies?" Ian underscores the irony in the Tanpinar's perception of memory in his paper, and he says that, again, and now I'm quoting from his paper, nothing could be more ironic in the analysis of a writer whose central theme was the politics of forgetfulness, than replicating that forgetfulness in the very act of reading him. I totally agree with Ian. And I can say that it sounds even as a kind of hypocrisy, more than irony, I can say. Tanpinar's portrait as an author has some interesting peculiarities, as Ian showed us. On the one hand, we see that in terms of artistic approach, his position seems close to the one of fascist aesthetics. Here, the memory Tanpinar brings forth is one that belongs to the aesthetic nation that is homogeneous, harmonic, and united. And of course, this is a conservative vision. But on the other hand, he's a literary modernist, fond of the European avant-garde. So in terms of literature, he's not conservative at all. We all know very famous, highly conservative, even fascist literary modernists like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound. And of course, Tanpinar was a much milder personality, but we need to think more on this. We need to think of his and Yahya Kemal's linkage to this fascist aesthetic. I think, as Ian underlined, it's very important. And my last point is about the term catastrophe. Ian mentions the incomprehensibility of the event. It means that the catastrophic event is so harsh, it is so shocking that it goes beyond the boundaries of one's understanding. It is intangible and even beyond the capacities of language to express it, so that you either forget it or you go crazy. I think this is an important explanation for the survivors, for the victims, for the remnants of the catastrophe. But to be candid, Tanpinar and others like him, Turkish authors, were not survivors. On the contrary, they were on the side of the culprit. And I think we need to define another perspective to understand this selective memory, and we need to construct a new theoretical approach to understand this silence, this lack of representation, and this conscious amnesia. Here I remember Marianne Hirsch's famous concept, post-memory. And she says that the term post-memory is meant to convey its temporal and qualitative difference from survivor memory, its secondary or second generation memory quality, its basis in displacement, its vicariousness, and its blatantness. Post-memory is a powerful form of memory precisely because its connection to its object or source is mediated not through recollection, but through representation, projection, and creation, often based on silence rather than speech, on the invisible rather than the visible. So here, my million-dollar question here is, how does the post-memory of the agent of the catastrophe function? I mean, the one who renders it, the one who paves the way for it, of course, especially in the case of Turkey. Those people, those authors also have their own post-memories, but we have new tools to explain it, to express it, I think. And I think Ian's wonderful paper gives very important insights for a future theory, which will explain this very hard question of Turkish literature. Mostly we have forgot to ask until today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Really, Fatih, those are wonderful, wonderful comments, and I scribbled down quite a few of the sources you mentioned. Do you want me to sort of briefly say something, and shall we? And before we go to the QA,
I think I think we can do that. And in the meantime, I would like to remind our audience that they can post their questions using the Q&A function, or they can raise hand if they would like to ask their questions directly. Please.
I mean, amongst all the fascinating points you raised there, Fatih, just to sort of with the last one, well, no, actually, the first and the last one. The first one, like the idea of there's no abiding interest, because you find this in a number of cultures. You find this even historically, like going into the past. It surprised me, for example, in medieval Sicily, how you had Arab, Byzantine, and Latin intellectuals in the court, and they almost didn't. There's no interaction in the same court, of Roger II, and there's no interaction that we can see, at least. So that's interesting. The contiguity, the adjacency of a culture, even the like literally coexistence without any kind of what would appear to be sort of curiosity. But I think it's interesting that, is there a blindness there? Because nevertheless, you have, and you know infinitely better than I do, you have interaction, social interaction. In the case of Tanpinar's case, you have biographical interaction. We have sort of, neighbors he had. And I do find that sort of fascinating, like how that empirical phenomena is filtered. Because Tanpinar so sensitively responded to his surroundings when he switched on his microphone, right? He sensitively, ultra sensitively responds to nuance, to architectural nuance, to the whole wall of phenomena that surrounds him. But then, how does what kind of filtering takes place there? I think that I find that interesting, because jumping to your last question, how does the memory of the agent of catastrophe function? Which I think is a wholly valid question. In the case of Tanpinar, there's a weird interstitial role for people like Tanpinar, because of course he's not he's not a victim, but there's an almost voyeuristic sense to this, like he's watching on, he's witnessing. You can't really say that he threw himself with energy into this in the way that, for example, someone like Nihalatsas did, and that's sort of dithering, if you like, and the kind of spectator and the perverse kind of flânerie that is involved when you're in the middle of a conflict, and the possibility of a kind of cowardice ultimately. Like you see these things, you realize that they're bad, but this dome and this couplet and this battle moves you so profoundly that in the end it's a kind of ontological trade-off. I find those mechanisms fascinating, because they say something quite pathetic about all of us, right? All of us, like not just Turks, like it could be immigrants, it could be refugees, like the kind of internal trade-offs, in the same way there were in the Second World War, there were people who would sell their neighbors to the Gestapo for a kitchen unit. There's always going to be those people, right? And I'm interested in that. I think I'm interested. And of course, there's something tantalizing about it, because how would you ever, you're never going to be able to grasp that fully. I mean, we have the heavily edited diaries of Tanpinar. There's a lot of controversy about how the diaries emerged, and lots of people unhappy with the way and maybe we will get a more comprehensive and faithful edition of those diaries to come. But even if we were to get that, as you said yourself, there's something beyond language here. There's something, the silence of disgust and self-disgust really never gets recorded, other than that in the things that people don't say and don't do. And this is what I think is most frustrating about the kind of the projects that people like me perhaps somewhat foolishly take on. That you're chasing ghosts in many ways. I don't think in the case of Tanpinar you can fully get what's going on inside someone. Sorry.
Yeah, I meant that with blindness, it's also something intentional. Okay, So I totally agree with you that those people, including Tanpinar, were very pragmatic agents, and those people were subject to, these kind of autocratic statehood, and they their actions were always had some specific and spatial care. I understand that, but even in their diaries, even in their very private writings, we don't see even slightly, we don't see a search for mourning. Okay, a real bitterness, a real sadness. It's not there generally. In general, of course, there are exceptions, and this is also very striking. Okay, they see everything. They see that Balyans, they all those great architects of the Ottoman Empire, important Armenian musicians, and all those important people who created the Ottoman Muslim culture. They are always there. They notice those people, but they don't. They are not sad for the, they are not sad for what happened to the Armenians. They don't look for an explanation. They don't look for even kind of a legitimization of what happened, mostly. That's what I mean with blindness. Okay, so this is striking. Maybe this is not specific to the Turkish example, of course, but it's again striking because you are producing literature. It's something internal, and it's mostly comes from your inner experience. But it's striking, and I don't have a specific answer, as I said, and that's it.
Do you not think that there's, in various writers, there's moments where there is guilt which is unacknowledged and which surfaces in wholly incongruous ways? I'm talking about spectral, which ghost stories are never, I'm thinking of, for example, ghost stories or spectrals which have no political content whatsoever, but which clearly, this is what I'm an example from popular culture. Let's get out of Turkey for a moment. An example of popular culture in North American would be the Native American and the various ways in Twilight and so on, in various aspects of popular culture where there's some kind of supernatural or ghost, Stephen King's Pet Sematary, all of these examples where there's some kind of unacknowledged spectral recognition of something, even if they don't care, but it's there. And I guess that's what I wanted to say in Huzur with the apparition of this Armenian woman. I don't think it's a conscious expression of guilt, but I think there's something weird about it. And it's the weirdness I guess I'm interested in.
It's a wonderful example of what you propose. I see and I understand, but I'm talking about the general pattern. Of course, the specters of the catastrophe are there, even in songs, even in the folklore, even in the classical narratives, it's there. But as a modern writer, the authors generally refrain from thinking of it. Of course, there are also exceptions, like, for example, Kemal Tahir, talks about it, or Edip Cansever's poetry has obvious references. I don't say that this is a total lack, it's totally inexistent, but I see in the general pattern the lack of search for the possibility of mourning, because mourning is literature, mourning is art. As I think, as far as I understand. So this is a striking lack, I think, which founds the modern Turkish culture and literature. This is foundational, I think. This is basic and foundational. Yeah.
I mean, I think what we're in, sorry, but I was going to quickly say, what we're encountering here perhaps is the very real limits of an Islamic or a Christian, or indeed even a secular humanism, right? We really are sort of seeing those moments where the humanitas of something falls away as soon as it leaves a certain prescribed area. On that cheerful note, back to Firat.
Oh, this is such a fascinating exchange. I do have two questions, but I would like to give the priority to our audience first. And so I think the first question, which I believe Fatih briefly touched upon, but is about the case of Kemal Tahir in terms of his voice about Armenians. So in other words, I think the question invokes a comparative perspective. You know, when we switch to Kemal Tahir, what do we have as opposed to Tanpinar? And the second question, I'm going to include it, is slightly different. The first question is, and more directed toward Fatih, how do you place Kemal Tahir in terms of his voice about Armenians? Can he be defined as a pattern all by himself? And the second question is from Hera Sukyas. Do the Armenian writers of Turkey, do they write about Turkish characters present in their writings? So both questions sort of like you to consider this other dimensions in the discussion, the other side, so to speak. Any comments?
Turn over to Fatih, definitely.
Yeah. Yes, Kemal Tahir has many references to 1915, but I think it's a functional tool for him. He wants to criticize the Kemalist regime and the Republican politics, and he uses Armenians as a tool for his criticism. So it's not something that, you know, paves the way for a pattern of the narratives on the Armenian catastrophe. I don't think so. There are many other examples too, but Kemal Tahir is very functional. You know, he enjoys it, I think. Again, no mourning is there, I think. Yeah. That's my answer for the first question.
And how about, please go ahead.
Do you think that, do you find that sometimes, like within Turkish literature, or, you know, this is generally within literary communities, the outsiders generally have interesting disparities from mainstream narratives, right? Sort of, I'm thinking of Said Faik, I guess, most immediately, who was capable of quite sympathetic representations of Armenians in his stories, and of course, who was homosexual or bisexual. And I think that I'm interested in that, and you know, within Europe, you find the inverse of that. Yeah, you find figures who you know, like Nietzsche, for example, who feel themselves alienated, radically alienated from their own cultures, and so on the logic of my enemy's enemy is my friend, discover some kind of ontological bridge, if you like, with other alienated figures? Or do you think that that's a pattern in Turkish literature?
As sci-fi is a very good example, but I think again an exception mostly. And sci-fi, he's a melancholic writer, and his melancholy includes many different elements. And one of these elements is the non-Muslims of Turkey. So he likes them. He likes to mention them. But I agree with you. His point is totally, and his perspective is totally marginal out of the main canon, especially in the early Republican literature. But still, he has bits and pieces, some representations and bits and pieces. Again, not a real search, not a real interrogation, there, I think.
Because I guess what I would be, sorry, we should look at, but I would just be interested in, because at the moment we seem to gravitating towards this idea that when people have like Hadri Edip Adava, when they have sort of rigid narratives, then then suddenly there's no kind of leeway, no kind of spiel around for any sort of incongruous minority, or there's no space in which you can begin to build a tolerant reception of the other. And I wonder, because I wonder if that's possible. I wonder if you can have situations in which people commit themselves to clear narratives. Okay, so they have clear identities. They're not kind of postmodern, open, hipster. No, there are clear identities, but nevertheless, within those identities is inscribed some kind of earmarked tolerance for a specific space towards another. And I mention this because when you look at post-colonial debates, very often sort of imperial versus empire versus nation state, one of the truisms that comes up again and again and again is how there is a kind of multiculturalism or a multicultural tolerance within empire. This comes up with the Mughals, it comes up with the Ottomans, and it also comes up, like, for example, with, even within the British and the Hohenstaufen, and all of these empires where people didn't necessarily have sort of rigid. I mean, they had clear identities, but there was a sort of flexibility towards a kind of polyphonic space, if you like.
Yeah.
And do you feel that is there a kind of, for you in particularly in 19th century and 20th century Turkish literature and Ottoman literature, do you see that? I mean, do you see a gradual hardening, and with the advent of a nation-state narrative, or would you say that even in the 19th century, Ottoman narratives rarely sort of incorporated?
Yeah, I think there were different channels, and there were nationalists, and there were proto-nationalists. Islamists were kind of proto-nationalists in the 19th century, I think, and like figures like Namık Kemal, they were not interested in representing the other of the Ottoman Empire, these non-Muslim Christians. But there are important guys like Ahmet Mithat Efendi. Of course, his opinions were much more open to the practices of multicultural life in the Ottoman Empire, and he did not refrain from narrating, for example, Armenians in his novels. So, and he thinks that this is the locality of the Ottoman Empire, and its richness. It's not something bad. It's not something to be eliminated, but the Ottoman Empire is beautiful and rich and vibrant, or with all those, non-Muslim existence, and with different religions, with different languages. But still, he had a feeling of, the superiority of Muslim Turks in the empire. So, yeah, we have scenes from the 19th century literature which are full of the multicultural life, especially in Istanbul, but they are still, mostly exceptions and not very strong representations, I think. So, for example, even Ahmet Mithat Efendi has not a feeling of self-interrogation or seek for a new kind of imperial subjecthood, subjectivity, which presents a, fair and equal citizenship for all of the Ottoman subjects. So I don't know. I think the scene from the 19th century is not a hopeless one, but also it does not represent the vibrancy, the richness of Ottoman multiculturalism, or the multicultural scene of Istanbul, at least.
I know I promised to give the priority to the questions from our audience, but I think in that moment, one of the questions that I had in mind, and particularly after Fatih shared his point or observation about the lack of curiosity and absence of interaction already in the 19th century literary cultural milieu. I wonder if some of the sort of, if we are going to look for a culprit, right, in that it couldn't be the formal imperatives of the novel itself that sort of doesn't lend itself, to multicultural representation. You refer to Ahmet Mithat as an exception, right? But with certain limitations, right? I feel that, and maybe I'm being Benedict and Andersonian here, the very connection between the novel and the nation. So, and maybe it is not from that perspective a coincidence that you explore in your own work this cross-cultural conflict and negotiation in drama, right, rather than the novel, just as an afterthought to your conversation.
I mean, with literary modernism, like, you would imagine that the novel becomes a kind of Bakhtinian polyphonic space, right? A conference of voices. Because, we're speaking of Tanpinar's literary modernism here, the idea that there's a kind of textual, I'm thinking of, and Tanpinar read Joyce. And Joyce, without overtly idealizing Joyce, there's certainly this frustration with the cyclopean eye of Irish nationalism. And that cosmopolitanism, it says a great deal about literary cosmopolitanism, that it can flourish in many ways, but on the cosmopolitanism that threatens one's own sense of self is not tolerated. And I think you find that in a number of writers, but certainly in Tanpinar, it's not that Tanpinar was necessarily a narrow-minded writer in other respects. I mean, there's a lot of different nationalities, there's a lot of different languages, a lot of different mention of minorities, as you know, right? In Huzur and in, but it's not just about like being open or not to the other culture. It's being open to the other who may want to usurp us, or is perceived as wanting to usurp us, or who is challenging something that we are libidinally invested in. And you know, it might explain the slightly different treatment of Greeks and Armenians in Tanpinar's work, right? There's more references to Greeks, numerically more references to Greeks in Tanpinar's fiction, almost as if like the Greeks are the anodyne minority, the non-threatening minority. I don't know if you would agree.
I think, and from that perspective, yeah, like which other and what part of otherness of the other, right? And in a way, one of the observations that I had listening to your talk is like in our Tanpinar's selective memory or selective memory, there is, I always tend to find a difference, and probably that runs across Turkish literary culture, the Armenian inside the lost Ottoman cosmopolitan world, right? Different in certain ways than the Armenian in Eastern Anatolia, which is on the periphery of the metropolitan Ottoman Istanbul. So, you know, like the Eastern Anatolian Armenian sort of it becomes much more in sort of easier other element to be discarded or abandoned or not even invoked in the cosmopolitan memory of the empire.
But it's could I just briefly say, and I don't want to speak about Armenian literature because we have the expert here. I don't. But just reading Zabel Yasayan, her memoirs. Like what struck me was like there's a moment, and you'll know this, Fatih, there's a moment where she looks across, I think, to Üsküdar, she says, and she has these completely oriental description of it, like the minarets gleaming in the dawn. I only read it in English, so I don't know what it is in, but it's it's a strange, you know, like, because these are people you live with every day. You know, it's like me with my British Muslim friends suddenly talking about them with turbans on their heads. You know, it's a completely bizarre, it's a bizarre gesture. And I find that interesting that it's not just about, I agree with you, what you've said, Firat, but it's not just about physical distance, is it? For some reason, somehow we are able to sort of mentally transport minorities to the other side of the planet, right? Without them even moving 2 streets down the road from us, we can decide that they, and in the case of Zabel Yasayan, she's such an amazingly gifted and forgiving writer, like in so many ways. Like she's the way she talks about that. Sorry, but
thanks. Hazal, we have 2 questions from Hazal. First question from Hazal Halavut, and the second from Miri Tekdemir. Thanks. I would like to thank for their patience, but I think we can take these questions and then end our webinar afterwards. So Hazal's question is, while looking, and that's a question to both of you, while looking for signs of mourning in Tanpinar or for some other Turkish writers' texts, what are we actually looking for? That they were actually traumatized but cannot speak of their grief due to the oppressive politics? Or is it possible that there is no mourning or search for it because Turks did not think that they have lost something. That's Hazal's question. Any thoughts?
Fatih? I always have some. I've got a big mouth. I've always got something to say.
If I have to choose one of these two options, I think the stronger one is the second one. So I think there is no mourning or search for it. I think, and this is what foundational. This is what I find foundational for the Turkish literature. So yeah, we can look for some signs and some references of Armenians and Armenian past, Ottoman Armenians, and but these are not, I think, about any search for mourning. So I think Turkish writers in general don't think that they lost something. They don't have this feeling. So this is very important. I think the lack of this feeling is something that would determine the base of modern Turkish literature. That's it. But there can be some exceptions, of course. For example, I think of Edip Cansever's poetry and his tragedialar. So I think I have even at least a slight hope to find a search for mourning in Cansever, or maybe as Ian said, maybe inside Faik, we can look for it. They have the traces of grief, I think. They are those people, Cansever or Said Faik, are full of grievance, and their, I think, texts have the potentiality of grievability, as Judith Butler said. But again, those are exceptions, I think, and I have doubts, of course, to say that Cansever is looking for a real, mourning, and his melancholy is the full of this search for mourning. I can't say that. That's my unsuccessful answer for this very hard question.
No, I mean, I think I'm a tiny little bit more hopeful, optimistic, maybe. But not in the sense that I think there's going to be some moment of tremendous humanity that we'll stumble upon in Tanpinar. To answer sort of Halut's immediate question, like, I think I'm looking for blips in the kind of matrix of Tanpinar's universe. I'm looking for moments where a fissure occurs and something breaks down. I don't know necessarily if I think there's going to be any sort of flood of fellow feeling that gets repressed or anything, but it will be interesting to see how certain mechanisms fail to work in Tanpinar. And I do think that there's a real problem for Tanpinar there with his commitment to this ideal of European civilization that he always had. And the horror of what he potentially witnessed, or at least known took place. There was basically a Somme, a Passchendaele, call it whatever you want, on his home soil. And I think that's interesting. I maybe like Fatih, maybe I sound cold-hearted, but I don't expect. I've learned not to expect sort of floods. After so many years reading Western European texts, the number of Montaignes or Blake's or Shakespeare's you can find who, those rare individuals that whose world soul can transcend and glimpse a kind of, there's not that many. So my hopes aren't up. And I'm not really looking for that, but I am looking for how, sort of nationalist models break down, because I think it's very interesting. Those failures are very interesting because they can teach us something about how they emerged in the first place.
And Mary's question is whether we can say that Tanpinar's depiction of Armenians or minorities in general contributes to the nostalgic thought of Ottoman past. And as you were engaging with the first question, Arif Tapan, I think, intervened in a related and quite interesting aspect regarding Tanpinar's diaries and letters that, and beyond just the Armenians, that his diaries are filled with references, humiliating towards certain ethnic identities, such as Asians or Blacks. Although Tanpinar says we Turkish people are both Western and Eastern in Huzur, we see that Tanpinar expresses himself with a Western discourse in his private life. Therefore, can it be said that the absence, blindness of Armenians in Tanpinar is not only something specific to the ethnic identity of the Armenians, but also related to his view of Armenians as Eastern or just one of the others? So if you could please engage with these two related questions, and then we'll end our
I think it's always the question of like the different statuses of minorities. It touches a little bit on how we talked to about 10 minutes ago, the minority that threatens that threatens our world, our life world, if you like. I think that's where I would see, Arif Tapan is right that there is this kind of Western civilizational discourse in how he talks about, he has some pretty awful things to say about various ethnicities. Even though he had, he met, apparently he met Baldwin and was very impressed with how Baldwin spoke, and had heard from other people who had met James Baldwin. So again, we're getting back to this kind of cognitive dissonance, aren't we? That people can witness empirical phenomena and yet continue to privately cultivate wholly different worlds within themselves. And one of the things which prompted me to write about Tanpinar, to be honest, was when I was in Atlanta, I met someone who was doing, an African-American scholar who was doing his PhD on an African-American director who was a good friend of D.W. Griffiths. Yeah, D.W. Griffiths, the white supremacist, the birth of a nation, like the most horrifying. And, apparently Griffiths had African-American friends, right? So this sort of tremendous schizophrenia, which I think, though, in this case would be difficult to sort of employ that in the case of Turkish Armenians, because to keep this fair, Western civilizational discourse favored Turkish Armenians, and when they reported and represented Armenians, they were often depicted as an oasis of civilization in a sea of despotism and Oriental. Do you know what I mean? So there was and Tanpinar would have been aware of that. That's another weirdness about his Francophilia, that he's indebted. I don't think I'm exaggerating Tanpinar's Francophilia here. He's indebted to a vocabulary which really sort of sees the Armenian as more civilized than him, right? So for all of his adoration of Valéry and Guide and that, there's this sort of set of contradictions there. So I think there would be something substantially different about the way he would speak about those kinds of ethnicities. But
yeah, okay, let me say a few sentences on this too. I agree with Ian. First, people have many different faces, and reading in a diary and reading in a novel, producing literature and writing a diary these are different things. So I think maybe Tanpinar's diary shows that he's not a very respected person to the others of the West. But anyway, in his novels, he narrates dreams. He is a literary modernist. He has all these modernist techniques. So all those can display a very different Tanpinar to us. It's very possible. So yeah. So I don't think that there is a direct relationship between the lack of Armenians and the Tanpinar's disrespectful view of the Black people or Asians. This is the first thing. And about the nostalgia and memory, I think Tanpinar's nostalgia and memory is an attempt to to produce a kind of mysticism which functions as a kind of how to say new opportunity to undermine the lack of Islam and Islamic culture in modern Turkish Republic. So he wants to include something which would be a new religious Islamic mysticist something for this new life. So that's the lack he feels in his veins very strongly and very deeply. So that's how nostalgia and memory incorporated in Tanpinar's works, I think. So that does not include Armenians or minorities, or other people, so on. So this is, I think, this is something very functional and maybe even intentional. And he has his own modernity project. I think it's obviously something westernized, but he wants to include something to protect what he lost from the 19th century in terms of religion, Islam, and this of this mysticist stuff. So I can say no, it's not contribute to the nostalgic thought of Ottoman past.
I think it's a really important point as well, what you've just said about the way mysticism was almost kind of ersatz. It filled what Tanpinar perceived to be a lack in the cold, sterile modernity of the new republic. Can I just add to that, answering Özge's question, is that as a Brit, this deletion, the recollection of imperial pasts and the deletion of unpalatable things, whether it's Armenians, whether it's slavery. I'm very familiar with this process. Yeah, we have there's a whole bandwagon at the moment rolling quite happily along as I speak on this sort of rewriting and whitewashing of imperial history, the Raj and so on. So it's just a little moment of consolation from another part of the world.
Thank you so much, Ian and Fatih, for this really fascinating, Ian for the talk, and Fatih for your really perceptive response and the exchange, and to the audience for their engagement with in the conversation through their questions. And for sure, this will be a memorable, in a positive way, occasion, definitely for me, but I'm sure for all the audience. I hope we can have a sequel to that physically here in Doha, when conditions permit. Thanks.
Well, thanks for hosting us, Firat. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Firat.
Good night.